Hey, I hope you're well. Today I want to show you to get good at Terraform, you need to have a toolkit. In this toolkit you need to know some of the most common tools that are available. And one of those is conditional expressions. I'm going to show you real quick in this video how to use them. So we're on the Terraform documentation site right now. This is the page for conditional expressions. You can find it underneath right here, expressions. And there's quite a few here. This is conditional, there's for, splat, dynamic blocks, etc. I would say you actually need to know most of the expressions as opposed to the functions where you really only need to know there's like 100 of them. You don't need to know all of those. You don't need to know the most important, most commonly used ones. But expressions, I would advise you to go through all of these at some point, all of these expressions, because they do come up a lot. Today I'm going to show you conditional expressions. This is the syntax. In general, you have a condition and you put a question mark, and then separated by a colon you've got do this if the condition is true on the left hand side, or on the right hand side do this if the condition is false. Difficult to see what it really means. Let me show you an example. In fact, I'm going to show you 4 examples here. So this is the most common one. I've got to tell you straight up, conditional expressions, 99% of the time they're used is when a variable changes, then you test the condition and you take action depending on what the variable is. So for example, variable environment. You know what environment is, like production, pre-production, staging, development, whatever. And here we got a locals block to say create a local called instance underscore type that can be either of these two things depending on this condition. So I realize it's a little bit weird the way you've got the condition in the middle of the local statement. The local instance type equals one of these two values here, but that's just the way Terraform is. So if the environment is production, then make the instance type a T2 large. If it's anything else that's not production, then make it T2 micro. And then you can see it's later used in this resource block here for an AWS instance. If you don't know, that's basically a virtual machine. And the AMI, well, that's fixed anyway, but the instance type will vary depending. It will be local to instance type. So there's instance type, which can be either T2 large if the environment was production, and if the environment wasn't production, it will be T2 micro. So again, this is the classic case of using a conditional expression in Terraform. It's nearly always a one-liner. It's nearly always a condition based on what an environment, what a variable has been set to. In this case, the variable is environment. Very, very common. Now that example I showed you was for 2 conditions. It was environment production or not. That's the most common, but sometimes you want more than one condition. It could be you want multiple different environments. So for example here, what we've got here is production, staging, or development. We want it to be T2 large, T2 medium, or T2 micro. And it's slightly different. Whereas we had a one-liner, remember we had instance types equals, and we had this conditional block, and then we had these at the end. This time it's done slightly differently. You got instance types, which is a local, and in here you've got a map, or well, an object, very similar, key value expressions. So production equals large, staging, medium, development, micro. And what happens here is, depending on the condition, you will get a different one. So it's actually kind of different, right? It's actually, there isn't the conditional expression in here this time. It's not looking to test a particular condition. Instead, we've already laid out the conditions ahead of time. So we're saying here to look up here, look up whatever the environment is, and then as the key in instance types at the left hand side, and then return the right hand side, the value. So you see here it says whatever the environment is, make instance type equal to the right hand side depending on whatever the left hand side was. And then here is when the environment is neither production, neither staging, neither development. So it could be, I don't know, pre-production, or it could be something, it could be sandbox or something like that. So if you don't find it in the lookup, then just assume a default value of T2 micro. And then just like last time you got here, instance type equals local to instance type. Let me show you this. This might make it a bit more clear to you. If I select both files and do a right click and compare the selected. Let me just move this across here, and you can see the difference here. Whereas before we had that one-liner, you see there, one-liner for whether it's production or not production. In this case we got more cases: production, stage, and development, and also none of those three. So we actually have four cases instead of four conditions instead of two before. Then you can actually stick it on one line. You can actually compound your this question mark, this conditional expression. You can compound them. You can say, is it the first, is it the second? You know, it's like having three ifs: if this, if that, and if this, else do this. But instead it's much better to do it like this. This is like a case statement in Bash, and you say, I'm going to lay out here the cases first, and you got to look those up, and I can still have a fallback if it's none of those. So yeah, you can see the difference there in the way we've done it. This is fine using the conditional expression if it's only two conditions, one or the other. But I recommend if there's any more than that, then don't even use conditional expression. Use something like this local lookup and do it like this. So moving on, I want to show you something else which I've called a complex local. And this is where I just want to show you that it doesn't have to be a single string or whatever. You can actually have it much more complex. So here we've got an example of security group rules in AWS, which are typically for key value pairs. You've got the protocol, the source port, the destination port, and the sitter block to which that applies. And what we've got here is we've got this interesting expression here. So it's a tuple of, I guess these are objects, a tuple of objects. So what you're saying here is, if the environment is production, then these are the rules that we want to use. And if it's not production, then these are the rules. There's actually only just the one that we want to use. Okay, that's the difference, and you can see here how it's used. And it's a dynamic block because it allows, well, within the block there's then a for each. So this means you can have multiple rules. This here, you can see the protocol, the from, the to port, the sitter block, and it will repeat this as many times for as many rules. 2 in the case of production, or 1 in the case of anything that's not production, and it will do that for each. It will iterate. You can have a million rules and it will spit out a million versions of this. So that is a more complex way of doing it. I don't often create these myself. It can be a little bit tricky with all the different braces and brackets and things like that. I often just describe to the AI what I want, and it can come back with something like this. Now finally, let me show you something that I call dynamic conditions. So far everything has been in response to a variable, and actually that's the most common use case. If the variable is this, then we want to do this. If the variable is different, then we want to do something different. 99% of the time that's what you're doing. However, there are other interesting things that you can do with conditional expressions. So in this case what we have here is we've got a data source that's looking at existing AWS instances, existing VMs out there. And often people will use these, they'll put an instance ID, they're only looking for one existing VM that they need some information from and use it further down in their Terraform configuration. But you can actually use this to read multiple instances. So in this case here, we actually have a filter to say, find any instance out of, maybe we've got 100 VMs, and find any that match this filter. They have a tag, and the tag, the key or the name is environment, and the value of the tag is production. So any virtual machine that has a tag of environment equal production. Let me just show you where this comes from, by the way. So I'm now on the Terraform documentation page, and you can actually see that the first example it's got is very, very similar here. It's using a filter like this, and let me show you actually where these filters come from. You can see here that there are several valid keys that you can check, and for a full reference, look at the AWS CLI reference, because that's also using the API for describe instances. So this is the page. Let's go down to filters, and you can see here there's a whole lot of stuff that you can filter on. It's pretty insane. But the one that we're using, if we go all the way down to tags, then you can see here that you can look for the key value combination of a particular tag that's assigned to the resource. So this is what we're using. So what we're doing is we're saying out of all the VMs that are in our AWS account, we're only interested in this case of the ones that are in the production environment, as comes from the tag. And then what we want to do, let's jump ahead a second, is to say we want to create a new AWS instance, a new VM, and this instance type is going to depend on something. So let's look at the local instance type, which is here. So that's marking the end of the condition, and these are the two choices. So if the condition is true, if the condition is false. So what is the condition? The condition is that if you look at the data source above, and then you look at the attribute IDs, and we're just back at the Terraform documentation for the data source, and pretty typical for a data source, there's a whole bunch of attributes that you can get, because this is pretty typical. You want to extract some information from your existing resources. An ID is the most basic attribute that there is. So actually, I don't think it's important that they took IDs. I think the key here is that what happens is the number of VMs that you have corresponds to the length of this here, this attribute. I think you actually could have used other attributes, but ID is like a kind of nominal attribute that every single resource is going to have. It's like the most important attribute. And if you've got 5 VMs, then length of this attribute will equal to 5. If you've got 10, it'll be 10. If you've got 20, it'll be 20. So what we're saying here is, look at the number of VMs that you've got, and if you've got more than 5, then the new instance type will be T2 large. Whereas if you've only got 1 or 2 VMs, so it fails this condition, then we got the false here, then make your new instance a micro. So what this means is, this means that your first 5 instances are going to be T2 micros, and after that your next several instances, 6, 7, 8, 9, 100, 200, are all going to be large. That's what this whole code does here. So I wanted to show you this example because 99% of the time you're going to be just depending on whatever the value of a variable is, maybe environment, maybe something else, then it'll change something one way or the other further down in your configuration. But this is a lot more intelligent. It's actually going out there, looking at your existing VMs, even filtering them, which we didn't actually have to filter them. We could have just left this out. It just makes it a bit more interesting. But in here, what we've done is we've said, look at how many VMs that we have, and depending on how many we've got, because we're actually using another function here, depending how many we've got, that will set a different condition and change downstream what our choices may be. For example, in this instance that we're creating, it will affect how big or small it's going to be. I hope you found this interesting using conditional expression, and I hope you feel better armed now with your toolkit for Terraform. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.